Today, I'm going to cover every episode of the first season of the YouTube White Boy Talking About Video Games comedically show, Scott The Woz. Think of this as an episode-by-episode companion through the series, where you watch the episodes yourself, then come back to this video to hear my scattered thoughts on the season and its topics. We got 50 episodes to cover this season, so let's just start the retrospective now. Episode 1, Nintendo Switch Wishlist. The first episode of Scott The Woz starts with him throwing out the Wii U box from his window, which basically sets the tone for the rest of the show. Other than that iconic moment, it's not as timeless as the other episodes due to the topic of the episode being a wish list for the Nintendo Switch, but you can view it as a nice time capsule of what Nintendo fans were feeling at the time. The jokes here have more flat delivery compared to what would come later on in the show, but that's expected. Not every YouTuber's first video will be a banger, and to give credit, you can see the makings of Scott's finest material start here. He just needed more time and experience to polish it up. Despite its historical value and showing how far Scott has come both in comedy analysis and topic selection, I don't revisit this one often. Episode 2, Nintendo Switch Presentation 2017. This is another current events episode covering the 2017 Switch presentation that revealed everything for the release year of that console. It's not that thorough, we just see Scott riffing on a few awkward moments from the show and then giving some general thoughts on the whole thing. Honestly, when Scott describes this era of the show as the Peach Fuzz era, this episode is the first that comes to mind when I think about that term. Episode 3, History of Smash Bros. Rumors and Leaks. This episode strikes a good balance between the kinds of news reporting Scott did in the first two and having a more evergreen topic since it's about the history of leaks and rumors rather than one that just happened. It's a well done look at all the silly rumors and surprising leaks that surrounded Smash, even giving me nostalgia for the Smash Bros. 4 days with the infamous Rayman render. It also presents a reoccurring segment for Rumors and Leaks episode called Critique That Leak, which is where you can see Scott's distinct yet amusing humor start to solidify into a more confident perspective. It's the first episode I legit enjoy on its own without the context of it being the early years of a YouTuber I like. Episode 4, Why the Wii U Failed. A pretty simple episode going over some of the reasons for the Wii U's failure. In fact, this would start many episodes of Scott venting about the Wii U era of Nintendo, so that's a plus. Though with this being so early on in the show, it's not the best Wii U based episode he would make. Episode 5, Tinder. One of the first concept episodes of Scott The Woz, basically a glorified comedy skit as opposed to a stupid Nintendo topic. Though this one still has some editorialization going on by riffing on the average dating app experience. Lots of all-timer jokes in this one, especially with the opening bit and the Windows Movie Maker trailer. By this episode, we are slowly but surely seeing Scott find his comedic voice, even if there's still some rough edges that got ironed out later, but those jank parts still do have their charm. Also, this is the first episode to explicitly mention Scott's love for Madden 08, which will be very important for the show going forward. Episode 6, What the Wii U Did Right. This episode has a runtime of 4 minutes and 20 seconds, which is probably the best joke to come out of this episode. It's a pretty basic, dare I say, even disposable episode, just nothing in the jokes or analysis that make it stand out from the rest, but hey, we all have our off days. Episode 7, Most Wanted Switch Games. Another video that was more topical at the time, since the Nintendo Switch was a week away from the release of the time of this video's upload. It's pretty bare in terms of wacky things to talk about, though in retrospect, it is nice to see games that did end up happening, like 3D All-Stars or Nintendo Switch Sports, or get disappointed at games that didn't happen, like a new Punch-Out. Episode 8, Nintendo Switch, 3 days in. The title says it all. Scott's thoughts on the Nintendo Switch 3 days into the system's existence. As someone who also bought their Switch at launch, it was quite nice to revisit this exciting time in Nintendo history. A well put together overview of what the console did and didn't do well at launch, and I think it's where Scott's ending bits really start to come onto their own instead of being painfully awkward with a moment in silence and then BAM! Blue screen. Episode 9, Console Wars. This is one of my favorite early episodes of Scott The Woz. I love the absurdity of the opening and ending gags, the old-timey music used to set the tone of a war documentary throughout the episode, and despite a poorly aged line about how the Switch would not outsell the PS4, it's an interesting look at the history of different video game consoles' performances through the era. It's a legit goodie. Episode 10, Physical versus Digital Games. This episode is where you can see Scott's comedic styling start to become more solidified, especially in the commitment to the bits by clearing out his room to emphasize the all-digital lifestyle he's going through throughout the episode. Some may view the lack of a definitive ending on the subject as lazy, but I thought it was a nice change of pace. Instead of ending on a wrap-up of Scott's feelings, we end on uncertainty of which side of the debate is superior, letting the viewer decide for themselves based on what Scott has shown us. Episode 11, a look back at the Nintendo 3DS. This is one of the first of many console retrospective episodes, and it includes one of the most famous Scott gags, that being throwing Chibi Robo Ziplash into the toilet. My main problem with this episode is more of a technical issue, as Scott's mic has an oddly amount of pop in this one that wasn't present in past episodes, and it carries into the next few episodes, which may not be the best for those who like their audio prestige and clean. It's still a fine, if a bit undercooked look at the lifetime of the Nintendo 3DS. Episode 12, Breath of the Wild isn't perfect. One of the first solo game review episodes, kinda sorta, is mostly talking about a singular part of the game, that being its faults. While I appreciate the boldness of giving some fair critiques to a relatively new game that everyone was enjoying a lot at the time, I do feel some of the points made are a bit undercooked and could have had a bit more to them. But hey, the cereal gag is great. Episode 13, Micro Consoles. I've always had a fascination with these things, so I like that Scott went out of his way to cover them. It feels very close to a more modern episode, with the loud volume of Scott's voice, the more polished humor, buying a bunch of shit just to talk about for one video, and the ending rant summing up what Scott thinks in a silly way. The formula for a modern episode is there, just with a little bit of the peach fuzz season 1 is surrounded by, but hey, it's still a bit charming. Episode 14, Star Fox Zero. I only played Star Fox Zero once via a rental system, and I didn't like it despite how much I wanted to, and this video does a good job articulating what many thought went wrong with one of the Wii U's last major games and biggest flops. I do hope Star Fox gets a chance to move on beyond the original N64 someday, but for now, we're left with this culmination of all the bad traits of the Wii U era of Nintendo in one stinky game. Unfortunate. Episode 15, Stop Smoking. Another skit concept episode, this one being a 420 special where Scott has to start smoking to stop smoking. It's funny, though I'm curious if Scott's past in Pollution Patrol will be brought up again in the future of how many recurring elements the Scott The Woz show has now, or if it's just going to be left in the Season 1 era. Episode 16, Mario Kart 9 Wishlist. I would normally say this is one of the more topical at the time episodes, but Mario Kart 9 still doesn't exist at the time of me making this video. Anyway, this is one of Scott's better wishlist videos. It has a lot of great unique ideas for a future Mario Kart, both in tracks, characters, and even items, and I appreciate him not defaulting to just make a Nintendo Kart like most future Mario Kart wishlist videos do, and make sure it's a Mario game still first and foremost. Episode 17, Definitive Editions. These re-release topics are ones I find quite interesting, as I'd rather play these games on my newer systems than dig up an older one. I thought Scott went over the pros and cons of these ports in a very fair way, as great arguments are made about the pricing and complementing these ports with new releases instead of oversaturating the market with them. One of the best editorial pieces in the early season, hands down. Episode 18, The GameCube was the best. This is another console retrospective video, and it would be one of the earliest topics to get redone in a later season, but as for now, Season 1's GameCube episode is a solid look at one of the fan-favorite eras of Nintendo's existence despite the commercial underperformance. Personally, I never had a GameCube, but I was always fascinated by its library of games, and this episode emphasized that jealousy. Though I did find that comment towards the end of the PS2 not being as loved as the GameCube a bit strange, as many still praised the PS2's lifetime as Sony's peak as a console manufacturer. Though I think I get what he meant, as people who bought the GameCube were more likely to get attached to it because it was a system for playing games than the PS2, which a lot of people bought for function over any attachment to the games on it. Episode 19, The First E3. This is one of my favorite sub-series of Scott The Woz, looking at the history of E3, the Electronic Entertainment Expo, that took place in the summertime where publishers would announce new games and endeavors. I used to love E3 till it died after 2021, so it's nice to take a look at these press conference past and see if they worked in retrospect when the hype is all said and done. It also starts one of my favorite visual gags in the show, the knee slap rating system, which really shows Scott's commitment to quick visual gags that would get even bigger over time. Much like Season 1, this E3 episode shows the jank yet charming growing pains of seeing where something neat all started. Episode 20. Fixing the worst game trailers. This is one of my favorite Scott The Woz episodes in the entire series. You got the witty commentary and gags, more solidified obviously, but I love the idea of trying to give constructive feedback to improve poor marketing instead of just doing the usual critique and shit. The video style of fixing something doesn't always work, but Scott here is quite respectful instead of full of himself, while offering simple yet effective solutions to clean up the problems presented. Episode 21, Nintendo Mini Console Wishlist. I love how Scott created custom UI for these consoles in the editing booth to really show how far his editing skills have already come in just half a year of making the show weekly. That's all I have to say about it. Pretty enjoyable wishlist vid. Episode 22, Ranking the Final Smashes. didn't really connect with this one, to be honest. Scott ranking the Final Smashes in the Super Smash Bros. Series up to Super Smash Bros. For Nintendo Wii U and 3DS is fine, but in retrospect, it does feel incomplete now that Ultimate and all of its DLC have come out. Episode 23, a look back at E3 rumors. There's some pretty interesting fake rumors here, like Acid Ghost for Wii U presented by Eminem, but more importantly, it does have one of my favorite poorly aged Scott moments where he mentions a rumor about 2 Metroid games being revealed at E3 2017, only for that to be real in the form of Metroid Prime 4 and the Metroid 2 remake. Episode 24, E3 2017. Normally I'd fit this episode in the same category as wishlist topics of how relevant they were at the time of the upload, but since Scott was already doing a sub-series looking at E3's past, I think it makes sense to cover the newest E3 at the time they happened, plus it brings some nostalgia watching bits of the conference years removed from the original airing, even if this E3 was more disappointing than others. Episode 25, Super Mario 3D World, a critical second look. A pretty typical game review of Super Mario 3D World that I don't have much to say because I myself reviewed 3D World a couple years ago when the Switch port came out, and Scott would give this game a more fleshed out critical third look in a later season. Episode 26, Fitness Games. I like how this is a more positive look at the topic of motion controlled fitness games than other YouTubers have done. These games can and have helped people get into shape, so it's nice to see Scott acknowledge that while still cracking wise along the way. Episode 27, Most Wanted Smash Bros. Stages. Another wishlist video, this season is full of them, though much like the classic consoles one, the recreations and mockups of Smash Bros. UI and the editing are really slick. Also, a couple of these did actually happen later on, like Great Plateau, Inkopolis, ARMS Grand Prix, with a couple of fun oddball ideas thrown in, like Nintendo Land and Virtual Boy stages. Episode 28, Who will be the next Sega Microsoft? It's Microsoft. Even the video knows how easy this question is to answer. I personally think having 3 console manufacturers is good for the industry, as competition is very important so the companies can learn from and one-up each other. It's still an interesting question to pose on who will stop making consoles like Sega did first, but I think it's gonna be a while before any of the big 3 leave their positions as console makers. Episode 29, ARMS vs Splatoon. This video is funny in hindsight since Splatoon is still going strong while the last thing ARMS got for its franchise is a Smash Bros. Character with no sequel in sight. I do appreciate him using the launch Splatoon 1 as a basis for the comparison to keep the playing field even, and it's an overall neat comparison even if one was clearly stronger than the other. Episode 30, Gaming on a Budget. This is one of the shortest episodes of the series, which is why it's kind of pace-breaking to have a montage of Scott's local game store set to 8-bit music take a good minute of the runtime. Despite that, I appreciate the sentiment of this episode of using limitations and finances to get creative and expand your horizons in terms of your media consumption. Episode 31, The Art of Speedruns. This is a pretty good introduction to the world of video game speedruns and the communities that surround them that could encourage someone to even go deeper with the topic on channels like Summoning Salt or even try speedrunnings themselves. Episode 32, Gravity Rush. This is the first of the woefully underused sub-series, Tales from the Backlog, where Scott takes a look at a random game, usually a non-Nintendo one, that are just rotting in his big shelves. I haven't played the game yet, though I really want to, but it's nice to see Scott expand his horizons this early on from the Nintendo bubble that so many associate him with. He also does a pog face at the end. Great episode. Episode 33, Game Consoles That Refuse to Die. This episode starts with Scott breaking a PS2, and the amount of things to break is only going to grow from here. Anyway, this is a fascinating topic, because we all assume when a new game console comes out that everyone's going to move on in a year or two, but some people are just loyal to their old stuff either due to budgeting or other reasons. Episode 34, Sonic the Hedgehog 1991. A typical review of the first Sonic game, a lot of understandable takes here, but I do want to defend the aesthetic of Sonic 1. In the video, Scott complains about how only Green Hill Zone really pops of colors compared to the other zones, but when you consider the plot of Sonic 1 has the Hedgehog going further and further to Eggman's quarters to stop his mechanization of nature and animals, then it makes more sense when the game's levels would look more high-tech and a bit more drab as you progress. Still a fine review though, I just wanted to give my 2 cents on that comment. Episode 35, Amiibo. The payoff to the Bowser Amiibo joke is so good, and the video it's attached to ain't too shabby either. Kinda crazy how Amiibo's the only survivor of the Toys to Life craze, but as Scott said in the video, it makes sense given how Nintendo treated them more as neat collectibles than necessary for game function like Skylanders. Not to mention, for some of these characters, it's the only way to get a modern figure or merchandise for them at an affordable price. Episode 36 plus 37, the best and worst games of all time. Bundling these two episodes together since they come back to back and are basically a two-parter of how similar the subject matters are, just of opposite ends of quality. Both videos have phenomenal opening bits, one poking fun at the absurdity of getting mad at a 7 out of 10 review score, and the other featuring the mastermind Mr. Scoliosis. Also, this episode is the major reveal that Scott is a Mac user, so big oof. Episode 38, NES and SNES Classic Alternatives. The kidney running gag was amusing, and the reviews of the digital alternatives make good points about emulation and how to build a console like this. But the episode speaks for itself, not much to say. Episode 39, E3 1996. Another classic E3 episode, though with the lack of archive footage from Sega and Sony from the event, Nintendo got the bulk of the analysis and riffs, which makes sense, but it does lead to the video feeling a bit unbalanced in terms of coverage. Episode 40, A Console's Last Game. This is a good topic, but Scott didn't really elevate it as he just kind of spends the video listing off various consoles' last games with little editorialization or comedic quips. Kinda disappointing, but still fun to learn about this kind of stuff. Episode 41, the Nintendo World Championships. An entertaining look at Nintendo's early esports / competitive endeavors, which is weird to hear in an era where Nintendo hates the Smash Bros. Tournament scene. It is a bit disappointing how the last of these events happened in 2017, the year this episode was released, though maybe the pandemic had something to do with it. Either way, it's a fascinating legacy. Episode 42, Wii. Underpowered, yet underrated. The Wii was my first video game console, so this was quite a nostalgic but fair look back at the good and bad at one of the most popular Nintendo consoles of all time. Episode 43, Polybius. The first Halloween episode, and it's a neat blend of the comedic concept episodes like the Tinder or smoking ones, and a typical gaming editorial episode. The first half has Scott explain the urban legend of Polybius, and the second half has Scott chase the elusive entity. And out of all the episodes this season, this feels like the most callback to an AVGN era video game review, with the whole fight against the Polybius arcade cabinet. Luckily, this episode leads into the more charming elements of those videos instead of the more dated and out of place ones. I'd honestly recommend this episode to people who want to get a good taste of the Scott The Woz show, especially the more modern episodes. Episode 44, The Legend of Zelda for the NES. While it's a pretty cut and dry Zelda 1 has an aged well game review, I do appreciate Scott acknowledging the time it came from and giving credit to the game guides for helping players unlock the fun in the games rather than detract. Sometimes even I need guides to help me with games, and that usually leads to me having more fun than getting lost all the time. Episode 45, Super Mario Galaxy 10 Years of Bliss. Okay, so I'm recording this in 2024, and we're getting very close to 2027 where Robo Bolo reigns supreme, so if you're commenting from 2027, let me know. Oh yeah, and this episode has Scott gushing about only his favorite game of all time for its 10th anniversary. It's fun. Episode 46, Black Friday. Seeing all the GameCube prices in this episode through those catalogs makes me really mad at the secondhand game market. Either way, as a former fan of consumerism and Black Friday, kinda fell off both a few years ago, this was a fun look at the various deals and products gaming companies would offer to boost their holiday profits. A good episode for all you fans of numbers. Episode 47, Call of Duty on Wii. Oddly, this was one of the most standout episodes of Scott The Woz to me, and I can't articulate why. It's probably the mix of a niche but fun topic and the consistently great jokes in this one. I especially love the little dance Scott does when he's talking about Call of Duty World at War on the Wii. Episode 48, Lost in Localization. Uh-oh, this episode was kinda messy, not gonna lie. I don't think Scott went into enough detail or background about why localization happens the way it does, or why these conversations and discords are had for some games. I still think some good points are made here. It's just too broad and big of a subject for someone who openly admits to not be into the RPGs he's talking about getting localized. Episode 49, Super Mario Odyssey vs. Zelda Breath of the Wild. Alright, this is more in Scott's wheelhouse. Pretty good comparisons of where each game succeeds and falters, though the highlight of the episode is definitely Scott's briefly lived advice column career. Episode 50, A Madden 08 Christmas. We finally arrived at the first season finale and Christmas special of the Scott The Woz series. This is a landmark episode for the show, being a more story-focused adventure with bits of video game talking thrown in, and these are often fan-favorite episodes for the community, myself included. This episode also introduced a majority of Scott's friends as supporting characters for later in the show. This is where we meet Joe Robertson as Terry Lessler, Sam Esseg as Jep Jab, Dominic Metro as Wendy's employee, Jared Wise as Officer Steel Wool, and Justin Womble as an anchorman, later renamed Geriatrics in the far future of Season 4. This episode has Scott visiting the Vegans Anonymous meeting for the holidays, but he brings milk as a backup plan, which pisses off the group, so Scott tries to calm them down with some hilarious Madden 08 talk, but no matter the version, the vegans aren't having it. This pisses off Scott to a point of destroying an innocent copy of Madden 09 in a fit of rage. Scott heads to Target, steals every copy of Madden 18, the newest Madden game at the time, and attempts to frame the vegans for a nefarious deed. As you can see, Scott's obsession of Madden 08 is leading him down a dark path. Without accepting different perspectives, he's stagnating in the same old Madden 08 phase. It's cool to love Madden 08 or whatever thing you're passionate about, but to push it on others when they're clearly not interested or just don't get it is not healthy for forming friendships. Unintentional themes or parallels to religious debates or not, I do think it's clever how this is the first episode that showcases what would become Scott's supporting cast, as once he gets over his obsession, he can finally start to form friendships. Besides the cool themes and messaging to chew on, I think this is one of the funniest episodes of the series. So many all-timer jokes, both in the writing and the way the lines are delivered, but a standout has to be how the cops stopped giving a shit about who stole all the copies of Madden 18 from Target, because a new one just got announced, meaning the last one was worthless, perfectly summing up the endless cycle of sports games in the modern age. This is legitimately one of my favorite Christmas specials, not just for a web show, but of all time, and it set a high bar for future Scott Christmas specials to come. And with that, that's every episode of Scott The Woz Season 1, covered, reviewed, analyzed, whatever you call what I do. While there was some natural jank and peach fuzz that Scott himself has pointed out, I still find a lot of enjoyment to be had at this season. I always love looking at the earliest years of a YouTuber to see how much they've grown and how much has stayed the same, and this was no different. And we still haven't even covered some of the show's best material yet, so if you want to see me cover the other seasons, make sure to give your feedback in the comments below and hit all the funny YouTube buttons.